This is Duke University.
The first thing is just to say, because I assume that there'll be questions and discussion after this, is that I think it's really regrettable that no people of color or black people and colored people, as we call them in South Africa, who are part of Open Stellenbosch and were in the university and in the movement are not here to speak. Unfortunately, 4 or 5 people were lined up and then for various reasons couldn't make it. So I think it's really regrettable because I think that that's a much more important discussion than honestly just, I didn't go to Stellenbosch University. I come from the University of Cape Town, which is nearby. And it's obviously more complicated because I'm a white filmmaker. So I think it's really regrettable that there's no one there to speak. In fact, the person who was going to speak is Macheleche Matume, who's the incredible man who said the last words. The university must look like us. But what I would like to say is that I know people in Open Stellenbosch extraordinarily well, and many of them were dear friends even before the movie was made. So if you have questions that you would otherwise have directed at members of Open Stellenbosch, I have some degree of ability to recount the likely answers if you'd like to ask those questions. Cool, so that's the first important thing to say. Just to give context, I was at UCT at the time, and as I said, a lot of my dear friends were at Stellenbosch University. I was studying at UCT, and I was hosting a radio show called Contraband, which ultimately became the media company for the purposes of this film that produced the film. And I did a lot of student affairs stuff, and I ended up covering Roads Must Fall very intimately, which was a similar organization to Open Stellenbosch, run by people of color, to critique whether or not the decolonial project, as it's called in South Africa, had unfolded well at the university, or whether the university was largely a place that was still a bastion of rich people and white people. And in South Africa, if you are white, or at least your race, is an overwhelmingly strong correlation with your class. So if you're white, you're more than likely to be in the top 1 to 5% of the economy, and if you're colored, which is a complicated term that I might not go into now, but it means something else in South Africa, then you're more likely than likely in the next stratification. If you're black, you're most likely at the bottom because of the history of apartheid that separated people. So Roads Must Fall started at UCT, and there were a number of people from Stellenbosch University who came to see the protest that unfolded at the University of Cape Town, and then started a similar organization called Open Stellenbosch. Many of their primary issues or reasons to exist and run the organization you would have heard about in the film. And then after about 3.5 months, it became very clear that the Roads Must Fall conversation about UCT, because UCT is a very prestigious university in South Africa, was dominating the media context. So Stellenbosch was struggling to get any airplay, any media coverage, and any attention beyond the town. Stellenbosch is a very small town, and it's an overwhelmingly rich and white Afrikaans town. And Stellenbosch University historically is deeply tied with the history of apartheid in this country. So a number of former prime ministers and ministers under the apartheid government were educated at Stellenbosch, and much of the social Darwinist academia that allegedly justified racist apartheid policy was formalized and validated as legitimate academia by the sociology department at Stellenbosch University. So it's a very difficult place already where even now very few students of color get educated, and you, I'm sure, understand the problems with language that the film explored. So I went there the one day to see a couple of friends, and they did a protest at a student careers fair, which was allowed many very big businesses like mining companies, banks, and investment firms to exhibit. And the reason why Open Stellenbosch disrupted that careers fair was their point was, if we can't even get educated well enough to get decent enough marks to be considered by these companies, then these companies are complicit in the catering to only certain deeply privileged students at Stellenbosch University, and so this careers fair is illegitimate. That evening, a bunch of people in Open Stellenbosch who were part of that protest were identified, and this university released a statement saying they were intending to place disciplinary charges against these students. This was a really dangerous problem because Open Stellenbosch had struggled to get any media attention, which naturally would cause the sort of pressure that could potentially cause change at Stellenbosch University up until that point. And when there are disciplinary charges against students at South African universities, it's very easy to threaten them into not making their cases worse, which naturally silences them. So Open Stellenbosch meaningfully thought that they were facing extinction. And I just happened to be sitting in a bar with a friend of mine when he got his email which said that there was an expectation that he would get disciplinary charges. And that night we decided that we needed to make a film that was so irresistible that, and that would be released for free for maximum coverage, that was as irresistible as possible, such that if South Africans were ever going to care about black students at Stellenbosch, they would care once they had seen this film. And if South Africans didn't see the film, well then Open Stellenbosch may as well have meaningfully died, because they were never going to get the kind of support that they needed to cause change. But we needed to do it incredibly rapidly because we didn't know if disciplinary charges were coming. So on that Wednesday night, we drove back to Stellenbosch. We were in Cape Town. I met with all of the members of Stellenbosch. We had a planning session. That Sunday, we shot for 4 hours. And the function of that was to allow them to air, all the members, every single grievance they could, because this could potentially be their last chance to cover all of their respective issues. And we would then we took the copy. So it was myself and 3 of my friends who are now also in various media things, but who I knew through ECT. And we sat for 2.5 weeks with 4 hours of footage, and we cut it down into what you just saw. And then we released it for free consumption on YouTube. It very rapidly went viral. So it has, I think, nearly 400,000 views now, but it didn't only get South African coverage, but it was shown on a number of international news organizations, at least in parts, like BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNN. And it got very, very significant worldwide media attention, out of which there was huge discussion of this in South Africa, particularly amongst young South African students in universities. There was also a lot of very scary backlash, so a lot of racist, kind of, I would say, similar to the Ku Klux Klan in function. South African organizations started to intimidate and threaten not only us as filmmakers, but many members of Stellenbosch University who were black, whether or not they were associated with Open Stellenbosch. But that eventually receded after a couple of months, although there was a very scary time. Stellenbosch University's executive was called in front of a special meeting of Parliament a couple of months after the film was released, because suddenly politicians in South Africa realized that they needed to start taking policy positions about what Stellenbosch University would do, because it was such a hot political issue. And out of the pressure from Parliament of the South African government, mid last year, Stellenbosch University changed its language policy to make all education 100% accessible and available in English at Stellenbosch University, to not diminish the opportunities for Afrikaans students to learn Afrikaans, but also, and potentially most importantly, the third major language in the Western Cape, which is the state or province of South Africa where we stay, is isiXhosa, which is the first language of millions of people in this province, and Stellenbosch University committed to creating more opportunities to learn in isiXhosa as a multilingual university. So that's the broad strokes of what's happened. Just 3 important things that I think are worth adding to the context, or 4. The first one is a word that starts with K that I'm actually not comfortable saying as a South African, was mentioned a number of times in the film. The Arabic version of that is kafir, and that's infidel. And that word was brought across by Malaysian slaves many hundreds of years ago to South Africa, or a couple of hundred years ago. And in Arabic and in East Asia, it's just a word for an infidel or a non-believer of Islam, but it has become the single most derogatory word that you can call a person of color in this country, which is why it was so impactful for those students to say they've been called that, to the point where many people, even people of color, are uncomfortable talking about it when talking about the word. So that's one important thing to add about the gravitas of that moment. Other things are, that became relevant to South Africa was the debate around language. The reason why the film and Open Stellenbosch pushes for English is because we have 11 official languages in this country, and very few people speak more than 2. So it's very difficult to communicate at all. And so there needs to be some sort of common language that can be used between people. English, because of the dominance of white people in commerce, has become the language of business, and also the predominant language of politics. Afrikaans was that language during apartheid, but that was quickly done away with because Afrikaans was seen as the primary language of the oppressor by people of color during apartheid. And so English is a natural and unfortunate necessary pick for us to be able to communicate effectively to each other, which is why English was pushed for in the film. The third thing to talk about that was had a lot of media attention and was certainly very important to me as a filmmaker was the fact that myself as the creative director and producer, director of the film, the producer, the sound man, and the videographer are all white males, none of whom went to Stellenbosch University. And so there's a lot of very complicated politics that I personally took on in how we were then going to make the film. But if you guys are interested in that, we can talk about that more. And then the final thing to say is that by the end of that year, there was such fatigue amongst students at Stellenbosch Open Stellenbosch students, that many of them left the university altogether. And the ones who did remain didn't even try to meaningfully form Open Stellenbosch again the following year or to keep it alive. So while Open Stellenbosch did achieve some kind of victory through the movie, Open Stellenbosch meaningfully no longer exists, and the discussion on a nationwide level has moved to fees must fall, which is an argument and a wider movement which says that we need to do away with, or we need to institute free higher education for all South Africans if we're ever going to create class emancipation through which primarily black people can get the kind of advantages that white people have through money to get higher education. So yeah, those are the most important contextualizers, I think. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Should we just open it up and have people ask the questions that they might have? The only restriction is that you need to be close to the mic so it'll pick up, so that Dan can hear, but also it gets recorded. I can rove with one. Can I pick it up and take it around?
Yeah, you can move them around.
Okay, if people aren't close to it. Okay. You're not asking a question.
I'm not just sitting next to her.
Who has a question? Yes, certainly. No,
just
get
forget
here to it. That's it. Yeah.
Dan, my name is Reginald Hodges. I'm retired, but I used to live in South Africa. I live in Pietermaritzburg, and you have
amazing.
You have produced a very powerful documentary. I have two basic questions to ask. One, if the Parliament has decreed that all instruction be available in English to students, is the university teaching in classes in Afrikaans and in English, which would mean that the students would be segregating again with black students in one class and white in another. So I'd like to know if that's happening. That's the first question. The second question is a similar type of thing happening in the other universities in Cape Town or Pretoria or Johannesburg.
Okay, so one thing to note, so I'll answer the first question first. There are a handful of universities in the country that do not teach in English first language because there is a struggle in the country at the moment, particularly in secondary and primary education of children, about whether or not it is in children's best interest to allow them to learn in their own language. Because obviously it is much more difficult as a child to learn from a young age in a language that is not their own. But the flip side is if you don't learn in English, you are very likely to be extraordinarily disadvantaged once you become an adult and try to hold a job or to get higher education. So even in primary and secondary school, there's a massive debate at the moment about whether or not it is good to have people learn in languages that are not English simply because of the dominance of English in comments, which is very, very difficult for many millions of South Africans. So when it comes to universities, most universities choose to learn in English or at least instruct in English. There are a couple of other universities that are very similar to Afrikaans in that one of their core purposes to be is to preserve Afrikaans language and culture because they believe that it is valuable and they believe that otherwise it will peter out and die because there's a massive anti-Afrikaans culture sentiment on the back end of apartheid naturally. Another one is the University of the Northwest, still known as PUCA, and their mandate, because they're public universities, is to make sure that however they instruct, they do it with as much ability to create access for any kind of student as possible. So the way that they brand themselves is to market multilingualism. And that's why the Northwest University, for example, also uses translation devices. So they're public universities, which means that they have a South African government mandate, but the South African government doesn't say you have to instruct in English. What they say is you have to instruct in such a way that makes it meaningfully accessible for all students, or at least the vast majority of students, which generally means you have to instruct well enough in English that people who have a solid grasp of English are at no disadvantage. And the way that the University of Pretoria and Stellenbosch, the University of the Northwest and Stellenbosch University in particular have said that they would deal with the issue of bad translation devices is to try to get more English instructors to ensure that all instructors who are principally Afrikaans speaking can instruct as effectively in English. And yeah, to make sure that translation devices are more effective. So I think that broadly answers both of your questions, although if you'd like to push me on either one of those for greater specificity, please go for it.
Thank you.
Catherine? Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I love this video this film when I first saw it, and I love it even more from hearing you talk about it, so it's nice. I really want to pick up on the phrase you used about feeling the necessity in the policy circumstances you were in to tell an irresistible story. Love the language of irresistibility. I'm a lawyer. I really believe in the court of public opinion, and we have to be irresistible not only in the court of, juristical interpretation, but also in the court of real people's interpretations of things. So I'm wondering if you can talk from both ends, right? In a story, you have a storyteller and you have a listener, right? And I'm wondering if you have any feedback on how these stories were heard. Did any of these stories land? Do you feel, as somebody who tried very hard to tell those irresistible stories, that the court of public opinion you were trying to reach was reached? And then the second part of this question is, how did the people who told those stories feel after they saw you take 4 hours of what they said and turn it into 30-something minutes? Did any of them tell you, hey man, you left some stuff on the cutting room floor that I really feel you should have had in there? Did you get any positive feedback or any critical feedback on that decision?
Sure. Okay. About the creating a narrative. I think your question is more focused on how people receive the stories. So I will answer it. I will answer that. But if you'd like to know more about how we chose to structure and create the film, I can also talk about that to try and make it irresistible. So Twitter is an incredible thing, even if it is suffering record losses at the moment from a business sense. And the hashtag Luister trended for, I think it was 3.5 weeks, and top trended in South Africa for 2, which meant that we could see exactly what was landing. Because the way that we structured the film was that most of the speakers would only speak for about maybe 15 seconds to a minute, 15 max at a time. And we designed it in that way so that people could understand and dwell on bite-sized chunks that could then be impactful. And the wonderful thing about Twitter was to see what quotes were most powerful and what really trended in their own right as quotes. So one of the examples, and again, it's so sad that Machalechi isn't here, but one of the examples was how can a university say that they must accommodate me as if I'm moving in on their space, as if they are welcoming me into their home that I don't have any right to belong in. Another example was about not even wanting to send, or rather killing your child than letting them come to Stellenbosch University, which was said quite early in the film. And I think it was a combination of the general sense of injustice or the horror that these students had to face that were reduced, because the way we structured the film was that we had a period of time of instances of racism, then a period of time of how difficult it is to study there if you're not Afrikaans first language, then another period of instances of racism, then the actual context of OS, what it wants, and how the responses to OS have been, and finally another context about the instances of racism. So we laced it in such a way that meant that there were lots and lots of anecdotal stories that were easy to digest. And that had a massive impact because so many Black South Africans came out and said, that happens to me all the time, but I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't realize that it was something that many people experienced, but that I could be outraged about it. And Twitter was a really effective means of seeing that dialogue develop and come into action. But the second thing was, in South Africa, because there are limited opportunities for most South Africans to even have access to the internet, Twitter, while being very influential on news media, so Twitter and social media very often influences what becomes news through traditional news portals. Twitter is dominated by South African university students. And so what we had was an enormous number of South African university students saying, oh my word, there should be a Luister film at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University and at Northwest University and UJ and Tux and WITS and UCT and UWC, because there were radical common threads throughout. And on the back of this film, many other films about other universities were made to try to capture the similarities and experience of what was going on at other universities. So that is how it became, I think, irresistible, and then eventually ended up in Parliament. On to the second question about the people who were featured in the film. So we were very honest and open, because the one thing that I wanted to say was that this wasn't a film created by me. I used my set of skills and my team's set of skills to best reflect, with as much truth as possible, exactly the concerns, issues, and experiences of the members of Open Stellenbosch. So we tried to remove ourselves as much as possible from the film itself and take as few editorial decisions as possible in order to preserve the original stories as best as possible, but still make it irresistible. That's why I don't actually feature as a question in the film, although you hear my questions twice, just to make it more clear what they were saying. So in the end, we did not remove major anecdotes about racism, although we had a very difficult decision to make about whether or not to investigate many stories of racism intertwined with very ingrained sexism and homophobia that many Open Stellenbosch students spoke about, and that were also central concerns to Open Stellenbosch. And we had to make a very hard decision to decide what would create the most irresistibility and virality, given that people are incredibly ADD online. Even a 35-minute YouTube film seems extraordinarily long to the average, at least South African, who's got limited data, limited resources to watch even 5-minute videos on YouTube. So the last and most difficult decision that we had to make was whether or not to include stories of systemic sexism and homophobia in residences, and unfortunately we had to make the decision to take those out. But we told Open Stellenbosch beforehand that we were going to do that, and we presented the reasons why, and they were comfortable with that. And ultimately, and this is actually quite scary, the only complaint that we got when we had Open Stellenbosch view it before we released it was, no one's going to believe us. It doesn't feel as bad as it is. Like, the representation of our stories on screen is not as violating to us as our experiences of those stories ourselves. We need to tell them again in a way that's more dramatic. And that was an experience that we as filmmakers also felt, because once we had all those interviews, we came out of that and we actually couldn't edit for a whole week because we were so emotionally distraught, having heard what had happened and seen it, that we became so desensitized during the filming process that we didn't think that the film would do well at all. And Open Stellenbosch had the same experience of fear that South Africans wouldn't care, and they were so desensitized to their experiences that they thought that their accounting of them weren't as impactful as to those who'd never heard them before. So that was the only significant complaint about the way that we, and I guess fear about the way that we created the film. But once, after a few days of it being released, with it getting the kind of impact that it did get, those fears quickly went away.
Thank you.
Okay. Can I ask a question, and then you have a question? Yes?
Yeah, just
Okay. So my question actually relates to Catherine, so can I just jump in quickly? Thank you so much for that, Dan. I guess I have a question about resistibility, and it largely has to do with the way that South Africa and the US look rather similarly in certain respects at the moment. And I'm heartened by your account of the power of this film to convince, because my first knowledge of Luister actually came about through having dinner with, let me call them, white South African acquaintances.
I understand exactly what you mean.
And who would understand themselves as being progressives. One of the daughters attends Stellenbosch, and the story that emerged was precisely about resistance to the story of Luister. In ways that echo so significantly the way that here in the US at the moment, with sort of post-truth, supposedly, alternative facts. The encapsulation of how she experienced watching Luister was that it was just really a pack of lies, couldn't possibly be like that. From
Oh, really?
perspective.
Okay, that's interesting.
And so I guess just very briefly, I wonder if you could sort of connect that to what seems to me to be a kind of generalized or shared problem of those who are already convinced of something other than what some of us would hope they'd be convinced of, are not going to be convinced, you know, and there is that challenge, and so I just want to throw that out there, and just very briefly, if you could respond to that.
Sure. So there's one fundamental difference between the US and South Africa, is that South Africa is a vast majority black country.
Sure.
So unlike the United States, where it seems like there even now seems to be an appeal to a majority white demographic by people of color to actually listen to their concerns, as Black Lives Matter has, I don't know if they've tried to appeal to white people, but they certainly tried to create a societal impact that is majority made up of white people in many cases. So there's one fundamental difference in that we were primarily appealing to black people to be aware of the experience of other black people in South Africa. So that's one difference, which means that maybe Leicester wouldn't have been as effective in the United States as it was here. Having said that, Leicester, you're right, was never going to appeal to people who firmly believe the way that they believe. Although I think that it requires an extraordinary level of, I think, racism to flatly tell, in the face of 30 accounts of black people, your response is, they're all wrong. They're either lying or they're deluded about how bad it could be. I think that that is, if not racist, consciously, deeply, unconsciously racialized. And I think that you should question yourself at the point at which you're willing to deny those many testimonies when your only experiences as a white South African is incredibly charmed. But I think in terms of irresistibility, maybe the most important thing that it did was for the people in the middle. So the white South Africans, and even black South Africans who didn't think it was that bad, but who considered themselves progressives and considered themselves not racist, and who considered themselves receptive to black people's experiences, they then had to take it upon themselves, internally but also externally in conversations with other people, that either they had to acknowledge that these black students at Stellenbosch University and everywhere else were really suffering, or that they were going to deny all of those testimonies. And I think that causes a mindset shift. And the interesting thing was, a year later, when a batch of new students, first years from high schools across the country, moved into different universities, the white students who fancied themselves progressive took it as given that universities were racist and white dominated. So although there wasn't a first generation generalized acceptance of the suffering of black people in many universities, there was a follow-up generation, immediate acceptance of how difficult it was to be black in many of these white dominated spaces, and that has power in itself.
Great. Okay, question in the back here?
My name is Monica. Thank you so much for the documentary. You really did.
Hi, Monica. Sorry, could you speak up a little bit?
Excuse me. But anyway, I'm saying thank you for that documentary. You did a very good job. I could relate with some of them, having come from Nigeria originally.
Oh, cool.
And also, I've experienced, and even my children have experienced that in this country. So, remember when my question is, one of the students was asking if they could come and talk to them, either the chancellor or whoever. I can't remember about the person, but one of the people in the authority to come back and to come and talk to them. And what they got from them, from the institution, was that it was insulting for them to come and talk to them. If I'm not mistaken, that's one of the things And having watched also the President of the United States yesterday, when he was, I could relate, just like the last speaker, the last person just said that you could relate what, is happening there with America. Yesterday, one of the what's the name again? The interviewers from one of the television channels or something like that was asking the president, have you talked to black couples?
Yes, I actually saw that hilariously.
And he invited them, and then immediately Donald Trump said to the lady, could you make the appointment? So, remember what the student said, could you come and talk to us as black people? But they saw it as insulting. So yesterday, when I was watching that, even before people started making comments, I said, how can the president ask just interviewers or whatever they call them to make appointments? And it's been on TV all over the world, how that could happen. And the other people have been talking to the president, or president inviting them, but he hasn't invited the black caucus. You could imagine how people are feeling. And also, there was a Nigerian student also in your documentary that said they're asking you from Nigeria, you too like to be a Nigerian. Yeah. You don't know what discrimination is till you feel it. Just like, if you're not a black person, maybe you're a white person, and one of your kids are very obese or something like that, you will feel it. Like even Donald Trump's daughter was in a place, I think yesterday, somewhere, they were doing, I read that, from the paper, on the internet, where they were doing some kind of fashion, something. Tiffany was just isolated, right there. So could you imagine how she was feeling till Hooper Goran, was the one that volunteered, for her to, sit with that. But what I'm trying to say is that it's really, very disheartening to know that things like that is still happening, And even Donald Trump accepted there is so much division, so we really need to work on that. It's very, very important. I'm glad, I'm in this here this time, and you did a very good job. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So my question was, did they come and talk to them?
Oh, in the end?
Yes.
In the end, there was a strange broken telephone because the executive of Stellenbosch University suddenly had to go to Parliament, and they were in the news and they were speaking to media, and Open Stellenbosch was saying, but why haven't you come and spoken to us? But they were also saying it through the media, because at that point it was an international news story. So in the end, they did have meetings, extensive meetings, and there were follow-ups on a couple of the racist incidents that were mentioned, but many of them were indecipherable to figure out. But the reason why the focus shifted quite quickly away from this in Stellenbosch itself is the fact that in 2015, Rhodes happened, and then the Rhodes statue was taken down UCT. Then Luister happened, and then Fees Must Fall happened. And Fees Must Fall started, and there were these massive protests because the government had announced that they were going to, or at least the government announced policies which would, because they're all public universities, they announced policies that would not give enough funding to universities, for universities to be able to avoid significantly hiking the fees for students for the following year, which incited enormous protests in many places, including Stellenbosch University, against that. And so the focus shifted quite quickly. But in the end, yes, there were meetings that then culminated in this new language policy that were considered because, as it is mentioned in the film, I do think that a number of members of Stellenbosch University's executives' hearts were in the right place. I just don't think that they had felt enough pressure or had listened properly enough before the film. Thank you for your question and for your kind words.
Okay, and so Catherine, what did you want to follow?
No, it's not a follow-up, mine.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I have a couple of questions. First of all, congratulations. I mean, it's amazing to have that effect with a film, for sure. And while I think that it's heartbreaking, as you mentioned, right, just to see it again and working on it, it's also, and I hope this doesn't, I don't mean this to be patronizing, because I feel this every time I go home. It's actually incredibly hopeful to watch a film where you can see young people being so amazing, and and really constructing an analysis that is heartfelt but also sophisticated and amazing about the conditions of their worlds and horrendous as they are. So I always generally feel, in encounter with South Africa, I generally feel pretty hopeful. And one of my questions is a little bit about that, which is, while I think that it's extremely smart to have kept the focus on language, both sort of as an activist gesture as well as sort of a media kind of move. It's clear, even from those stories, even from your focus, that, as you described, like so much more is going on around the patriarchy, homophobia, or white privilege in general. And so my one question is, there seems to be a real victory on some level around language, but is that only a beginning, or has it shut down to some degree? Has it sort of worked in favor of administrations in some way to shut down some of these other conversations? And then I have a filmmaker question.
Yes, ask it. Please.
I am also, as a white South African with two other white women making a film. Not quite perhaps as starkly as your situation, because it's a film about Americans' relationship to Africa, but But you mentioned that you had really thought carefully about the politics of your position as a white South African man making a film essentially about black people's experiences. And I'd really like to hear a little bit more about that, because as you say, yeah, sure, you were trying to be super sensitive, but you still holding the camera, you're still doing the editing.
Absolutely.
You know, you telling the story, and then what does that mean, especially if one does consider the idea of almost, you know, you want to hear more of this story, or these stories. You want, you know, Luisters from you know, other sort of spaces.
Okay, so the first question, if I remember correctly, is this a beginning, and is it beyond the victory of the language policy change more substantial? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so as I said, there's a term among South African students, many of my friends have this, called struggle fatigue. You know how hard it is to get through a university course at all, and then to try and fight an institution, and then convince an entire country to care, all while trying to desperately pass exams and make sure that you're part of a nationwide protest against increasing fees costs, which has its own processing, and you're occupying buildings, and you are for the 100th time explaining why you are suffering, and again somebody isn't listening. And I think it's really understandable that after a while people just get burned out profoundly. And unfortunately, because Stellenbosch University, so an unintended consequence of Luister is that Stellenbosch University suffered a 40% drop-off in black applicants the following year to go there, because very few black students wanted to go. And Stellenbosch has a desperate attempt every year to try and make it look like they are transforming, so they offer enormous scholarships to high schoolers of color to come there anyway, very often to study for free. So Stellenbosch University has maybe, I think at the moment, under 25% black students or students of color. It's struggled to find any more, and so it's still an overwhelmingly white Afrikaans and rural-dominated space. And something that I think is true of the United States also is that the more rural you get, the more conservative, Christian, racist, and white you get. And so Stellenbosch University is still attracting the majority of those students, and obviously instances of racism don't necessarily happen in clubs. They happen in unregulated spaces like clubs and pubs, the way they mentioned them, and it's hard to bring those people to account because you've got contradictory testimonies, and where does the jurisdiction of the university end? So I think it is fair to say that now that Open Stellenbosch no longer meaningfully exists in Stellenbosch University, many of the people who championed it then have moved on and have graduated or whatever, and have fatigue. That yes, there was that language policy change, and yes, that is good, but Stellenbosch University has not significantly changed. It's still a deeply awful place to be as a black person, a woman, and a gay, and a person who's not straight, who's not cis. So that's what I'd say in answer to that. As a filmmaker and a white person, so I'm principally a radio presenter actually, and so I do make films, but I also make a lot of podcasts. And I very, very often make podcasts with people who are, so my most recent one was with an incredible photographer who is queer and black, and her project online is to, in a world of Instagram which is dominated by white beauty standards, is to create a space for queer black people to be beautiful and validated. But of course, I chose to juxtapose her work with Teju Cole's writings. And even though Teju Cole is a black Nigerian-American writer, I, as a white person, was conducting the interview, selecting the quotes, etc. So I think that with every kind of project, I do firmly believe in humanism. So I do believe that humans can communicate with each other. And I don't believe in the intersectional black hole that says ultimately because you are so unique, you can't talk to anybody else because you just can't understand them. And it is a dangerous situation if you do believe that. So I do believe that fundamentally that white people can collaborate with black people, and women can collaborate with men, and straight people can collaborate creatively with gay people. I have to believe that, or we're not a common race or species. But I think that each different project has different contextual circumstances, and that governs the way you as a white person should act. So in Luister, it was fundamentally us trying to best amplify, like a loudspeaker, the tales of these black students from a position of separation. And that meant that, like a loudspeaker, we were just trying to make it louder. That's all we were. We weren't trying to change it anyway. So the way that we went about that, to diminish our whiteness and our kind of alienness from Stellenbosch University, was to, in the pre-interview process, before they came in front of the camera, my producer would speak to the students and say, what do you want to say? And the only thing that he would say was, this is how you could maybe say that in a way that is clearer. So the things that they were saying ultimately were their own words and their own tales. And then when we created the film itself, we tried to structure completed stories in the most effective narrative arc order, because obviously all of these different interviews happen independently of each other, and these different students at Stellenbosch didn't hear each other's interviews, so they couldn't construct those narratives themselves particularly effectively, and our specific skill sets lent themselves to creating those narrative arcs. So what we tried to do was best uphold the original purpose of those stories and the larger purpose of Stellenbosch, of Open Stellenbosch. And then the final question was, how do we make this so irresistible that it's the best version of these original messages? And ultimately try to diminish our own redoctoring of the process as much as possible in the ways that I've described. So I think that was our role as white people who were not at Stellenbosch University in that specific project, is my answer.
Dan, I'm terribly sorry, but we've actually run out of time, which is a
Oh, I'm
very
so
good
sorry.
thing. It's a very good thing, because it's been an extraordinary conversation, and I just want to thank you so much for being willing to do this. I know it's Friday night for you, and you're still on the campus of UCT in the engineering building. We really appreciate you and your work and all those who were in the film, and I think you and I will be in touch very soon.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you so
just one
much.
more thing. I know that there were a couple more questions.
Yeah.
If you'd like to still have those questions, please email them to me.
Yeah.
That would be great. I'd be more than happy
Great.
to do that. You have my email address. I'd love to
Perfect.
continue the conversation outside of these constraints.
Super. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.